Good afternoon. My name is Marco Davis, and I am President and CEO of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. Welcome to our CHCI Policy Issue Briefing, Identifying Effective Approaches to Stop Illicit Trafficking. When it comes to topics like these, it is important to hear from different government and community leaders on proposed methods to prevent illicit trafficking, while considering that some forms of enforcement result in increased stops of African Americans and Latinos, as well as the fact that human, gun, and alcohol, tobacco trafficking creates an underground market that is dangerous to communities. Panelists will address how trafficking of persons, guns, drugs, and alcohol and tobacco impact communities of color, require a whole host of government response and coordination, and have the potential to strain community relations with law enforcement. We are going to learn quite a bit about this topic from issue experts and policymakers on what steps and best practices have already been implemented and the work that remains. To begin the conversation, I am pleased to introduce Congressman Henry Cuellar, representing Texas's 28th Congressional District. Congressman Cuellar sits on the House Appropriations Committee and subcommittees on Homeland Security and Defense, and is a CHCI Advisory Council member. After hearing from Congressman Cuellar, we'll be joined by our moderator, Johnny Sutton, former Texas Attorney General and former prosecutor in the Harris County District Attorney's Office. Be sure to follow us on social media using the hashtag CHCI Policy Briefing. We hope you enjoy this discussion. Thank you for your time and attention. And now please welcome Congressman Henry Cuellar.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, thank you for joining us today to share your perspective on trafficking in the United States. We are fortunate to have such a distinguished panel of guests with us today to provide their insights on how trafficking across our nation's borders helps fund criminal organizations. When we discuss trafficking in the United States, that conversation often focuses on human trafficking. As we saw last week when the Secretary of Homeland Security testified before multiple congressional committees, trafficking across our southern border is top of the mind for the Biden administration, for members of Congress, and for members of our communities. Unfortunately, the plague that is trafficking in person is not only the trafficking we have to concern ourselves with. Trafficking includes many things. For example, last April, the United States Sentencing Commission released statistics on fentanyl trafficking, a big problem that we have. Between the fiscal year 2016 and fiscal year 2020, fentanyl trafficking offenders increased by over 1,890%. And it doesn't stop with the trafficking of person or illicit drugs. Trafficking in guns or even non-drug contraband, including legitimate goods such as alcohol, cigarettes, and other manufactured products, prove a highly profitable criminal activity that carries lighter criminal penalties than narcotics trafficking. According to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, in recent years, tobacco smuggling has become a lucrative criminal enterprise, resulting in the annual loss of billions of dollars in tax revenues and custom duties all around the world. We all must be a part of the solution to stop smuggling and ensure our borders are secure. I look forward to hearing from each of you on your perspective on trafficking, especially the impact that trafficking of persons, guns, and otherwise legal products has on the Black and brown communities in particular. Thank you, and God bless you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute panel on human trafficking and specifically non-drug related trafficking. Thank you, Mr. Davis and Representative Cuellar for the great start and the great words to get us going on this very important and interesting and complicated topic. Today, we've assembled a fantastic panel to discuss this problem and talk about the policies of it, their expertise in different areas, and what we can do going forward to make sure that our country is protected from traffickers, not only human traffickers and drug traffickers, but also those who traffic in, illegal counterfeit items, alcohol, cigarettes. There's all kinds of different things that are trafficked in the United States. And we've seen lately there's a push to make sure that some of these illegal things are not happening in the United States. And how does that impact on the ground of our communities? And especially, how does it impact in our Latino and Black communities? Over the last few years, we've seen all kinds of trauma in the field with encounters with officers. And is this going to create future problems for contact as we begin to enforce different kinds of trafficking in the United States? So what I'd like to do to begin is to introduce our fabulous panel. And what I'm going to do is let them introduce themselves. And I'd like to start with Dr. Claudia San Miguel from Laredo, Texas, Texas A&M International University. If you could give us a brief introduction of yourself, and then we'll pull through the panel quickly and then drop into the subject at hand.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the special panel. I'm Dr. Claudia San Miguel. I'm an associate professor of criminal justice and also dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. I have been studying and researching trafficking in persons, both at the international level and the domestic level, for about 17 years now. Some of my projects include training law enforcement officers at the International Law Enforcement Academy in Roswell, New Mexico, that was funded by the State Department. I've also written human trafficking courses for Texas peace officers. And more recently, I have been funded by the Department of Homeland Security to study domestic human trafficking, particularly of minors. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. San Miguel. Next, I'd like to introduce Gonzalo Martinez de Vela. He is from the Buffett McCain Institute and has done a lot of research on human trafficking in the labor area. And Gonzalo, if you could introduce yourself and where you are and some of your experience quickly.
Sure thing. Yeah, I came to this topic through my experience advocating for the rights of immigrants, specifically farm workers, first in New York and then in Texas. I was the manager of the Buffett McCain Initiative, which ran from 2017 to 2020. During that time, I had a chance to get a master's degree in criminal justice and really give some thought to this question of how we are addressing the issue of forced labor and human trafficking within the agricultural sector. So I'll be glad to get into that later on in this panel. These days I've gone abroad with a new day job, but I am glad to be back with you all virtually in Texas.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Next, I'd like to introduce Harris County Commissioner Adrian Garcia. Adrian has basically done everything there is to do in law enforcement, from being a police officer on the street to a leadership in Houston Police Department to Harris County Sheriff, and now runs Harris County as a commissioner down in Houston.
Johnny, thank you very much. I'm honored to be with this distinguished panel. I'm Adrian Garcia, County Commissioner of Precinct 2 in Harris County, Texas, which includes the city of Houston. As a former law enforcement officer, I have seen the...
Looks like we might have lost Commissioner Garcia for just a second there. While we get him back, I'm going to jump on to EdgarDamon, who is the former deputy director of the ATF. Oh, wait, Adrian, you're back.
Okay.
We lost you for a second. Continue on.
No worries. Thank you very much. As a former police officer, I dealt with this issue on the beat. Seeing many people being affected and being exploited because of their immigration status. And then as the director of the city's anti-gang office, I saw the transition of street gangs becoming integral to the work by human smuggling and human trafficking organizations and the cartels. And as the former sheriff, I saw it and dealt with it and worked with many pioneering organizations and initiated many efforts to try to get to the end result of this, and that's the money impacting the business enterprises nexus to where this comes forward. As the only American born in my family, my father was a bracero. I spent some of my youth in Mexico City, so I have understood just how this issue affects us from both spectrums. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Next, I want to introduce EdgarDamon, who was the former Deputy Director of the ATF and also a former Acting Director of the ATF, many years in law enforcement experience at the federal level. And welcome, Edgar.
Well, thank you, Johnny, and thank you for the group for inviting me to be on this panel. I do come with about 29 years of service. As Johnny mentioned, 29 years with ATF, Special Agent in Charge in New York. So I'm very familiar with the issue of firearms trafficking in this country and tobacco trafficking. And I was also the sheriff of New York City and actually instituted the very first illicit task force to deal with and combat the illicit tobacco trade in New York City, which is the #1 city in the country regarding illicit tobacco. So I look forward to giving my insights and chatting with the panelists regarding these areas that clearly impact the communities of color, and we need strong enforcement policy, and we need communication. So looking forward to the dialogue.
Thank you, Edgar. And last, we have Wayne Harris, who was the deputy chief at the Rochester Police Department, served many years as a street officer, and then worked his way up to leadership to where he basically running that office for years. And I'll let him explain what he's doing now. Thank you, Chief, for coming.
Thank you, Johnny, and thank you to the CHCI for inviting me today. Again, my name is Wayne Harris. I am a retired deputy chief with a little over 30 years of experience working in the city of Rochester, New York. I'm also a former executive board member for NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, and the current board chair and speaker for the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. And I've been working extensively around the country on not only the consequences of human trafficking, as we're about to discuss today, but also the unintended consequences of some of the legislation that's being written across the country to combat all of these, and specifically how some of these consequences impact our Black and brown communities and only serve to, further marginalize people that have been marginalized for far too long. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. I think it's going to be very robust and very educational.
Thank you, Chief. Yeah, I'd like to get it started. Obviously we've heard of this problem of human trafficking before. What I'd like to do is discuss all aspects of it, but maybe to start us off, maybe Gonzalo, if you could just start us with just sort of an overview. I know you've done a lot of study on human trafficking, all over the world and in the United States. Maybe give us just sort of your quick overview on, first of all, what it is, and then let's move to, some of these kind of new topics that we have that's not necessarily people, but commodities and all kinds of different things that we're finding, being smuggled illegally into the United States from China and all different places that we hear about.
Thank you. And I think a good place to start might be to clear up one of the most common misconceptions, which is the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling. While I was managing the McCain Initiative in 74 counties down in Texas, we did a fair amount of pre and post testing when we would do events and trainings, including with law enforcement and folks in the criminal justice system. And we learned that the majority, more than half of not just the general public, but also law enforcement was not able to correctly identify the difference between smuggling and trafficking. And that's really not on anyone's, it's anyone's fault, because we know that the media tends to say trafficking when they mean smuggling when it comes to the border. But for the purposes of this panel, we will remember, as many of us already know, that we do know that when someone is a client to a smuggler and is paying to come across the border willingly, that would be a smuggling situation. But if that person is in any way being forced, defrauded, or coerced, they become a victim of human trafficking, or what in other places we call forced labor or sex trafficking, depending on what the ultimate exception or fraud might be. And I think it's important to remember that a smuggling situation can become a human trafficking situation. So someone might begin that journey wanting to have a specific outcome, perhaps thinking that they have a certain opportunity on the other side of the border, trusting a group to do that and carry them across. And then during that journey, they might come across the wrong people. They might have a bait and switch type of situation, at which point they realize they do not have a choice. And they cannot leave, for example, a job or a home. A very common scenario is that people become indebted during this journey, as many of you know, and then cannot pay off that debt. So in order to pay off that debt, they might be obliged to stay on a job, or in the case of sex trafficking, provide commercial sex in order to pay off that debt, at which point we really at that point are describing a human trafficking situation.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that overview. And Edgar, you not only were you in the ATF for many, many years and literally were the acting director of the ATF, you also were the sheriff of New York City. Talk to us a little bit about, trafficking beyond people. Let's talk about trafficking of products. And, we hear a lot about fentanyl. We hear a lot about cigarettes and alcohol and counterfeit purses and all kinds of things. How do we deal with that kind of enforcement? What does that trafficking mean, and how do we deal with that?
Yeah, well, Johnny, that trafficking is in fact being conducted by the same organized crime groups that are involved in the human trafficking. The trafficking of illicit tobacco costs New York City, New York State, in hundreds of millions of dollars a year in lost tax revenue. And what it does, it impacts the ability of those communities to basically meet the needs of their citizens because it's lost revenue. And what you need you need a collaboration between the law enforcement community and those who are in fact engaged in the policy. Right now, New York City is the largest location for illicit, untaxed counterfeit cigarettes in the country. And that impacts all communities, but it impacts greatly the communities of brown and black communities because you have enforcement strategies that could in fact place police officers in a position of where they're having to arrest and take action in these communities for illicit tobacco. And when we look at the issues that creates, we need to have a broader conversation when we're talking about counterfeit tobacco. And again, that lines into also the trafficking of firearms as well. But we need to have a robust conversation with policymakers when they're asking for law enforcement to take action because it is an illegal activity.
Thank you, Edgar. I just had a minor nightmare. Looked down and I thought I just muted myself. So hopefully y'all can hear me. I was instructed not to do that, and I just did it somehow. Adrian, tell us, Commissioner Garcia, you were a police officer for many years. You were a sheriff. You've dealt with these issues, especially in some of the minority communities, of how enforcement. We want to enforce the laws. We want to protect the community, but sometimes the officers can, come on too strong, or they're asked to do things that put them in places and in situations where it's really difficult. Talk about us in the human trafficking field based on your experience and what you see as the best way to handle these difficult problems.
Yeah, thank you, Johnny. The role of law enforcement and where the community plays a part is one of the most difficult places to be when you're trying to preserve and protect the public safety. Everyone remembers 9/11. And after 9/11, we became immensely focused on ensuring that we were effective as a nation and as a consequence, local communities on our counterterrorism effort. The Harris County Sheriff's Office, before I became sheriff, had already adopted the policy of 287G. Very, very unpopular amongst the immigrant communities. When I became sheriff, I took the very difficult stance to continue to work with 287G as an effort to find those terrorists, those dangerous, violent people that would cause the greatest harm.
And tell us what that is, Commissioner. What is 287G? What is that? So people may not know.
It is the policy by which a local law enforcement organization can be deputized to work in partnership with the Immigration Customs and Enforcement Service. It's basically you do give some degree of immigration authority to the local law enforcement organization. And we worked hard. You know, as I mentioned, I'm the only American born in my family. I've been an incredible advocate for the immigrant and the undocumented community. But with the aftermath of 9/11 in our rearview mirror, I wanted to make sure that, and being responsible for the Port of Houston, the ship channel, that if it becomes disrupted one day, would cost our local and national economy about $300 million a day. So those are the things that I worked on. And so that relationship and with the focus on counterterrorism did create a gap between my organization and the community who might have the greatest insight. Ultimately, our new Sheriff Gonzalez, that policy. And we have worked closer together to rebuild and regain that trust. But this is the complexity that exists. If a community doesn't believe that you are there for their best interest, then they do what they're effective at, and that is to basically stay behind their closed doors. They, in spite of the national message of see something, say something, they won't say anything.
Right.
And so it's critical that we, make sure that local law enforcement remains in the community policing sphere, but finding strategic ways to be supportive of the national interest that implicate all of our communities. And that's why federal task forces have been one of the most effective tools that local law enforcement has been able to participate in. So that way the organization as a whole can continue its community policing mission, but at the same time be supportive with the data collection, information collection, intelligence collection that is essential for the success of federal law enforcement. So, but at the same time, law enforcement has to make a real commitment to creating that bridge, making sure that it's effective at recruiting a diverse and bilingual workforce so that there are advocates and communicators and trusted messengers within the organization that the community can gravitate towards. The organizations have to build relationships with those other trusted messengers in our communities, whether it be those faith-based organizations, whether those advocacy organizations, to ensure that there is a common goal in spite of our very specific law and order mission. So I'm proud that we've gotten there, that we were doing a lot of things well in the for many years, but the cartels are effective at adapting. And so as I hear the discussion about all the commodities that are a part of the portfolio of cartels today, look, we have a supply chain issues as a country. The cartels regretfully could probably teach us some lessons on how to resolve some of the supply chain issues.
Yeah.
So they're always effective at adapting because they have no rules to abide by, and so they always have us at a disadvantage, unfortunately. But we remain committed to building those bridges, protecting those undocumented that are being exploited. I trained all of my jail staff when I was sheriff in being able to identify victims of human trafficking and human smuggling, because they're usually in jail for something else that we're exploited into doing. So we have to remain diligent.
Yeah, that is so important, and I'm going to have Dean San Miguel address that in a minute, because I know she did a bunch of training in that world too, because those are victims that are very hard to identify. But let's bounce up to the northern border for a second, and Deputy Chief Wayne Harris. Chief Harris, you've been in Rochester for most of your career, I believe, as a police officer and then as a deputy chief. Tell us about some of your experiences in this world, and not only with human trafficking, but enforcement of trafficking of illicit goods and counterfeit goods.
Well, thanks, John. It's a good question. And as all of my colleagues will tell you, policing is policing. It's the same on the northern border as it is on the southern border. the issues that they face down in the South are the same issues that we face up here. And I'm actually very appreciative of Edgar bringing up some of the stuff with regard to the illicit cigarette sales here in New York State. The statistics on it are frightening. For example, almost 50% of the cigarettes that are sold in New York State right now are illegal. And if you consider that truckload of illicit cigarettes can bring in anywhere from $2 to $4 million with a very, very minimal fine, for being caught as a first offense. It's just become a lucrative business that not only the cartel are funding, but smaller street gangs are also figuring out that it's less problematic to sell illicit cigarettes than it is to sell narcotics. So, throughout my 30-year career, I saw the consequences of, some of these behaviors, some of this activity, illegal guns being brought into my city, illegal cigarettes being sold in my city, and quite honestly, something that the commissioner just mentioned, a lot of that money actually gets funneled back to further other criminal behavior, terrorism. So, the upstate New York area, the northern border, all the way across into Canada, it's the same. And the issues that we face are the issues that we all have to remain committed to addressing. And the only way we can actually address that is through what we're doing right now, having these conversations, being honest about it and talking about it, recognizing how all of these things impact our communities and working with our communities to develop strategies that can combat it. Unfortunately, what the cartels have grown to understand, what the gangs have grown to understand, is that their behavior, their activity causes fear in our communities to the point where our neighbors, those that we work with on a daily basis, are reluctant to get involved through public safety fear, through fear for themselves. But it's not insurmountable. I think if we continue to have conversations like this, if we continue to work in this direction, that we can bring some of this behavior to a close and to an end.
No, that's very wise, and I agree 100%. And really, this is kind of a super interesting part of this discussion. We've heard for many years, about human trafficking, and I really want to talk about some of the things that are happening. China exporting a lot of stuff illegally in the United States, and I don't think it's just China. I think it's coming from a lot of different directions. But Claudia, if you could just talk for a second about your training and on human trafficking, and then let's roll right into that discussion, kind of the policy discussion on, our politicians and the people at the highest levels in contact with you guys who are, you're literally on the border in Laredo. You're on the front tip of the spear. I know Adrian in Houston has got that kind of experience too. All of you have. So talk for a second about that, and then let's get into the policymakers listening to people like you when they're making these decisions about outlawing products.
So when I approach and my years of training different, law enforcement entities, either internationally, local, statewide, what we need to, and I'd like to reinforce that it is difficult to differentiate a case of smuggling and trafficking. Obviously, there's eventually the force, fraud, and coercion as you're looking at prosecuting someone for human trafficking. But what I think is one of the issues that it is the sticking point when you're taking a case of human trafficking to be prosecuted. You really need to educate the jury and the community as to what it is, because they may not understand the differences between smuggling versus trafficking. They may, for instance, think that a particular person crossed the border willingly. So they may not differentiate that. But, from my field, criminal justice, criminology, all this trafficking, including humans, drugs, arms, and any other, illicit substances, we're really talking about a criminal that's operating out of rational choice. So in criminology, we have different theories as to why an individual, an offender, engages in a particular crime. We can talk about sociological reasons, their upbringing, their neighborhood. We can talk about psychological reasons, is it mental illness? But, when we talk about human trafficking, I would say about 99.9% of the time, we are talking about an offender who's operating out of rational choice, meaning that they weighed the decision to engage in this illicit crime because the consequences of them being caught are probably very low. The chances of being caught trafficking a human or trafficking something, because law enforcement is engaged in other activities. And maybe the community, is not reporting these cases, readily to the police. And they know that. And they operate on that calculation. If I do this, what are the chances of me being caught? If I do this, what are the chances of me being prosecuted? If I do get prosecuted, how many years in prison am I going to spend? So it's a calculated decision.
Right.
And in order to deter someone from doing it, in terms of my field, that punishment needs to be swift and it needs to be severe. Otherwise, the person is not going to learn. They're going to say, well, if I'm only going to spend 5 years in prison, then, I might as well do it, because trafficking in humans is $1 billion industry. I can traffic a person, 20, 50, 100 times, especially if it's a minor. And same thing with, arms, so they look at that. We really need to look at, how are we going to deter this? You really got to look at, we need to pay attention to what's going on. We need to involve the community. It needs to be a holistic approach. So we've got to get everybody involved. When I look at human trafficking and labor trafficking, we really have to go down to, the smallest of things that we normally don't think about. Okay, let's do, the hospitality industry. Let's look at taxi drivers. Let's look at the flight attendants. Let's look at, teachers. Sometimes, when we talk about minor domestic human trafficking, you could have an individual trafficked that's attending public school. And so all of these people need to be attuned to these different, indicators of human trafficking, because if we don't, the police don't have the eyes and ears. You really need those, people on the ground. And unless that happens, it's going to be very difficult for us to really get a hold of this. And like I said before, these criminals, they're rational, they're innovators. They will innovate quicker than we will to try to, make a buck. And especially in this type of industry, there's a lot of money to be made. Johnny, you asked about, policymakers. Yes, they do listen, but, this is something that has to involve, other people other than the policymakers. We really have to get the word out and educate, the community, schools, all these different industries that I mentioned, because we really need, eyes and the ears to be, in these different facets of our everyday life to help us report these types of incidents.
I think those are
Johnny,
fantastic points.
may I piggyback on that for
Yes,
one moment?
you may. Go ahead,
because Claudia just she brought up a very good point, and I spoke on trafficking in Dallas in March for the hospitality industry, and I can tell you that there are entities in our country right now that are very, very committed to helping combat trafficking of every kind. Now, obviously, the hospitality industry is concerned with the labor trafficking and the sex trafficking, but the idea that an industry like the hospitality field would be willing to partner and work with law enforcement to develop strategies to bring all this to an end is very, very encouraging. And I agree with her 100%. That's actually how we'll bring an end to this.
Mm-hmm.
I agree too. Let's do kind of a lightning round here, since our time is flying by so quickly. Adrian, I know you've got a ton of experience in this. Give us some of your thoughts on what's happening in Houston in some of these questions.
No, the dean is absolutely correct. And when I was sheriff, I took a very unpopular position, not against, but with the Offshore Technology Conference, which is a reverend event for the oil and gas industry here in the Houston area. I partnered with an organization called Free the Captives, in where we work to promote the anti-human trafficking and sex trafficking industry with the attendees. The Greater Houston Partnership, which is an incredible business entity, took exception with it, but it was the right thing to do. And similarly, the other positions that I've taken is urging our local CEOs not to put a hospitality funding in the credit cards of their executives. Go wine and dine folks at topless bars and things of that nature. I remember when we had the city of Houston's hospitality director get challenged by members of council when they found that he had spent tens of thousands of dollars at a local men's club. and he said, "Look, y'all told me to get this conference at all costs." That guy kept his job, but it was a horrible lesson learned.
Right.
And this is exactly, if we tighten the policies and practices across the spectrum within government and in the private sector, we would do better at this, I think.
Yeah, no, those are great points. All right, well, I'm just going to open it up to the panel here for just a few more minutes, and then we're going to take some questions from the audience about some of these proposed bans. That, I mean, frankly, there's been some outcry from the minority community say when you put bans on whatever the product is, a lot of times that hits us. Police officers are coming into contact with us because they say, well, we smoke these cigarettes or we drink this product, wherever it is, and how do we deal with that to make sure that we're not stepping in and rousting innocent people, but carrying out what the federal government is wanting us to do? Anybody? Edgar, you want to start us off?
Yeah, if I could. I think one of the things we have to realize is when it comes to the illicit tobacco, the term that gets incorrectly placed with that is you get a lot of folks and policymakers who say it's a victimless crime. No, it's not. It is not a victimless crime. We are creating, what happens is we create a venue for the criminal element to insert themselves to make money off of the individuals who engage, who in fact smoke cigarettes. And the ban on menthol ban, most minorities smoke menthol cigarettes. Okay, that's just a statistical fact. So now we're going to place our law enforcement entities into the communities to enforce a law that impacts communities of color, black and brown, more so than any other. And we're not giving them the resources to do it effectively. And we're not really dealing with the criminal element that's making the money. We're punishing the end user, but we're not going after the criminal organizations. The sentencings are abysmal. Nobody's going to jail for trafficking in the cigarettes. But then we're going to lose the legitimate businesses who cannot compete with the illicit market. So now we're losing our institutional grocery store owners that are fabric of our community. We're losing them as well. And we're turning this into an open pool for the organized crime groups to basically have a stronghold, because we're not engaging the community that's going to be impacted by this. And we're not educating and engaging law enforcement so that they can have a seat at the table with the policymakers to say, if you want us to do this, this is what we need. We need training. We need to have an understanding. We need to have the prosecutors. You need to have the business community come in, and they need to explain what happens when you ban cigarettes, a product from their store shelves. What's the impact on them financially? Can they survive if the store across the street can sell the illicit tobacco product or the purses? And remember, it's not just illicit tobacco. Where you have illicit tobacco, you have counterfeit fentanyl. You've got the counterfeit purses. Okay, those communities operate as a whole. Anything that's illicit is worked out together. And in New York City, you can find bodegas and stores who basically treat it as contraband and hide it and conceal it in what used to be drug compartments. So that's my thoughts on that.
And Johnny, there's a historical aspect to this too that we have to discuss, and I'm glad this is the Congressional Hispanic Caucus that we're talking to. Prohibitions don't work. It didn't work in the 1920s when we tried it with alcohol. All it did was create organized crime, and along with the organized crime, the violence that came with it, the destruction of our neighborhoods, the further marginalization of poor communities, marginalized communities. It did not work with the war on drugs that we've tried when crack became an epidemic and marginalized people, black and brown individuals, became overly incarcerated. And it's not working now. The FDA just passed their ruling. To Edgar's point, the FDA just came out with a ruling prohibiting the sale and manufacture of mentholated tobacco products. And there are a number of states across the country right now with legislation that are trying to do the exact same thing. All they're doing is creating a further illicit market that is way too lucrative as it is. So just to paint everyone a picture, imagine in a state like New York where marijuana is now legal, but being a 16, 17 or 70 or 80-year-old person that's out there smoking a cigarette on the street and having a police officer approach that person just for the purpose of saying, where did you get that cigarette? Not because they want to arrest that person for having the cigarette, but to further an investigation, to figure out where those illicit cigarettes are being sold. That's one aspect of the police contact that's going to occur in our communities. The other that we've already mentioned is the violence that's going to come. If I'm Mr. Harris and a couple of gangs are posted outside of my house and they're trying to fight over territory just to sell illegal cigarettes, that's the connection that's going to occur with the police department and marginalized communities, the Black and brown communities. That's where that intersection is going to occur. So for all these people that support prohibitions like this, please consider that there are consequences to these actions. It's not just going to be that they prohibit it and we're going to, enforce what the health department says. That's not it. The illicit market that this is going to create is going to devastate the Black and brown community because, to Edgar's point, at least for cigarettes, 85% of the individuals that prefer tobacco prefer mentholated products. It's a bad idea. Prohibition is a bad idea all the way across the board, whether it's cigarettes or fentanyl. It doesn't work. We need to come up with other strategies.
Yeah, well, one second, Adrian, and I'll come to you. I mean, to me, that sounds like some real common sense from a career officer. I see other people on the panel who were officers, nodding their heads, but it does sound like, the exact opposite of what you said is happening here with this menthol cigarette ban. And then maybe that's what you were going to say. I don't know, but I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts and how can that happen? And maybe there's a way to achieve the purpose of saying, look, we don't want people to smoke, and maybe these flavored cigarettes are, luring in children, and that's really bad. But how do we do this in a way that, doesn't impact negatively on innocent people, and especially innocent, Black and Hispanic people that already feel put upon? So,
exactly. And I just wanted to add to this point that one of the initiatives that I just have done as a county commissioner was to work to create a model policy for the nearly 80 some odd different law enforcement agencies that we have here in Harris County to consistently provide the certification process for a U visa applicant. Those are the folks who have the greatest amount of intel, and a effective process to attain their certification letter for their U visa is one of the best carrots, if you will, to encourage them to create dialogue and communication with us and to be the witnesses and the participating victims that we could use for prosecution purposes. Nationally, and I'm glad we're talking to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, because nationally there are 10,000 applications or U visas that can be awarded in a year. I just met with my police chief and my sheriff yesterday, and already we have signed off on nearly 3,000 certification letters. Ultimately, we're not the deciders on this. However, if we were to open up that process and create this model policy, and just as an example, even though HPD, the Houston Police Department, and the Harris County Sheriff's Office are neighbors to each other, their policies on the crime victims U visa is completely different. And so now that we have a model policy, I was proud that the police chief has agreed to participate with it and coordinate with us. We have to do this so that we can get all the other agencies to follow. But the U visa is one of the most critical tools that we have, but we just need Congress's support to amplify it, make it stronger, make it better, so that we can pull more people out of the shadows.
Okay, well, that's great. Now, they had wanted me to get some questions from the people who were observing. I see a couple out there, so I'm going to throw these to the group. And the first one's a doozy, but I think it is kind of it deals with what we're talking about. It says, after a high-profile killing of Eric Gardner in 2017 by a New York City police, actually I think it was Staten Island police, but for allegedly selling counterfeit cigarettes, how has NYPD reform their enforcement policies to fulfill its goal while alleviating the potential impact on communities of color? It's a good question. Anybody want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, I think I can.
Edgar than Adrian. Edgar than Adrian.
Okay, I can look at. I mean, from NYPD's policy, they've basically taken a hands-off approach on the issue of enforcing and investigating illicit tobacco activity in New York City. And that's where my former office, the New York City Sheriff's Office, still has a robust illicit tobacco task force because they do fall under the auspices of the Department of Finance, and tobacco is a tax commodity. So my former deputies are still inspecting stores, and they're still conducting tobacco and cigarette investigations. And they are in the forefront of dealing with this issue in New York City. Unfortunately, the New York City Police Department does not view this issue in a manner that they want to go ahead and create an enforcement strategy to complement the sheriff's office. So I would say to that question, the police department has stepped away, and the New York City Sheriff's Office isn't basically enforcing it through their regulatory and their enforcement capabilities and authority.
Commissioner Garcia?
Yeah, I just want to say that one of the ways that we approach that type of circumstance here is twofold. One is that we have also constructed a model policy on the use of force to help minimize situations like this in any regard. But secondly, is that we have built relationships with the Greater Houston Retailers Association because those are the entity. That's the entity that is a principally minority-owned or governs the minority-owned retail stores in the community, the gas stations where these things are likely to be. And they've been very, very effective at being a very good partner, a transparent partner, and when you have that relationship at that level, it helps for them to provide the self-policing that is probably most effective.
All right, it's hard to believe, but I knew this panel would go by in a blink of an eye, but I think we have about 12 minutes left, and I really want to leave some time for y'all to make some of your final thoughts, give us some of your final thoughts. And I know we could spend 3 hours talking about this just individually, but why don't we start off, maybe Gonzalo, you haven't had a chance to talk as much as the others, and I know you've done a lot of research on this. Why don't we let you start off, give us sort of what you've thought of this discussion and any really points of view you want to leave us with.
Yeah, trafficking is such a broad topic. We've covered a lot of ground, but I think one common theme here is that community trust. And I want to draw a quick contrast between two locations that we have on the screen here. One where I got my start in this work out on the farms in Western New York. You have to give them credit there for having been one of the first to pioneer the task force model, the multidisciplinary task force. So really bringing the NGOs, the service providers, the legal aid outreach organizations into that federal building in Buffalo, and getting them in front of HSI, FBI, all the local law enforcement, and creating those personal relationships beyond just the shore, so that we could call each other when things happened on the farm. But then, kind of pivoting to my experience in the southern border down in the Rio Grande Valley, the 3 years I spent there, what that task force had that I didn't see quite as much, unfortunately, for example, in Wayne County, New York, is that I started to meet law enforcement and prosecutors who came from the community that we were discussing. So we have one example here, Commissioner Garcia, who talked about his family connection to the Bracero program. In McAllen, I walked into the DA's office and he showed me a picture of when he was a child farm worker in his own experience. And that's impossible to train and to teach. So while we are here with the Hispanic caucus, I think it's worth reminding ourselves of the importance of bringing our community into these spaces and into these points of authority, because that's the best communication strategy, is just to have that DA that can go out in Spanish and say, if you've been a victim of forced labor, you can call us and we won't just write you up for the cigarettes we found in the trunk or thing that's in the news will really look into whether you've also been a victim of crime and have rights, no matter what your story might be. So that's what I'm thinking about today.
Well, we really appreciate you thinking about it, and we appreciate all the hard work you've done on this subject. And may I say, muito obrigado por estar aquí.
I'm here in Brazil. That's why the Portuguese.
That's why I'm taunting him in Portuguese. Dean San Miguel, can you give us your, and again, I'm starting to crack the whip because we're getting a little close to the end. So maybe a two minute closing on your thoughts and what you think.
Yeah, so I think we've made a lot of progress, at least, when I started first researching it and just training on law enforcement. I think somebody said it before. I don't remember if it was Wayne or Edgar, but a lot of these things, when I would lecture to international law enforcement officers and even officers when I spoke at the TCLOS conference here in Texas, the commissioning body for Texas peace officers, a lot of the discussion, centered on, trafficking is really, prostitution. It's a victimless crime. The person decided to engage in this type of activity. And honestly, when I would lecture in front of officers from other countries, most of them would say, should we really be doing or investigating this type of crime? Most of them are prostitutes, especially when it comes to sex trafficking. But I've seen a lot of, changes, recently in the attitude of law enforcement officers trying to understand, the differences between smuggling and trafficking and trying to partner more with these different entities. Just recently, we drafted a proposal for A&M International to study, how do we get education out to the teachers, to healthcare professionals, really, like in the medical industry. We need to also, look at who's going into our hospitals, our minor emergency clinics for injuries. But going back, I think we've made a lot of progress, and I think there needs to be more communication among all of us. But also just different, people from across the country. There's wonderful things happening, in Dallas and Houston and San Antonio, where in addition to, trying to find the perpetrator, the offender, the trafficker, they're also targeting, well, who are the consumers? I mean, obviously there's people out there, buying this stuff, consuming this stuff, including, human trafficking victims. So let's also target that and what we could do. But in the larger scheme of things, I think we need to understand, what are the structural issues that are going on in other countries, in our country that are kind of driving these things, the supply and demand, because most of the victims of trafficking and most of, what is happening with this discussion is with brown and black communities is that they're vulnerable populations. They're doing it for a reason, and it behooves us to look at what are those reasons. Let's understand it. Maybe before we pass legislation that impacts these communities, there's something going on there that we need to understand, why they're engaging in this type of activity, and let's try to address. I think somebody posted it, addiction really has to do with, other issues. You can't just, expect somebody to stop doing something cold turkey, especially when it comes to addiction. You need counseling, you need education, you need therapy. These are long-term things that we also need to think about in this country.
Very well said. Chief Harris, your thoughts?
So, well, first I want to thank CHCI for inviting us all today, and Johnny, thank you for moderating this conversation. And for those that wish to continue this conversation, I can always be reached at wayne@wayneharris.org. Would love to sort of further this conversation. I guess I'm going to finish with this. As many of us have mentioned here today, there's a connection that must exist between police and the communities that we work with. This is the nature of community policing, and community policing, contrary to belief, is not just a police officer waving his hand as he's driving down the street or occasionally going into a store. It's really a law enforcement agency working collectively, collaboratively with the community that they exist in to develop strategies, mutual strategies to deal with quality of life issues that are impactful to all. That's what community policing truly is. And when we're talking about trafficking, whether it's an illicit substance or with it's human trafficking, the way we beat that is by working together and by developing strategies on multiple fronts, whether it's business, whether it's our educational system, whether it's our cities or local governments, state governments, federal governments. It's all of us kind of coming to the table, looking at a problem holistically, figuring out what factors are contributing to the crime that's occurring, and then developing strategies to stop that. So this is how we make this change. These forums like this are how we get that ball rolling, and I'm encouraging all of us to continue in this vein.
Thank you, Chief. I'm going to pause for 1 second because I was supposed to say this at the beginning and I forgot, and that is the hashtag for the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, and that is CHCI Policy Briefing, CHCI Policy Briefing. So y'all can go to that. In fact, it's up on your screen now, and there'll be links to this discussion and other things there that can be passed along. So sorry about not saying that at the beginning, but at least I got it out there. Okay, we're racing towards the end here. We only have a couple more minutes. I think I'm going to let Edgar go, and then I'm going to let Commissioner Garcia kind of clean up and finish it out for us. So, Chief Dominic, give us your thoughts, your final thoughts and recommendations.
Absolutely. First of all, I want to thank the caucus for this forum. This has been fantastic. I'm going to piggyback on what something Wayne was talking about on community policing. And what I would add to that is community respect. Respecting and understanding the communities that are being impacted by policies. And what that means is not only the policing aspect of it, the social service aspect of it. You need to bring all the agencies that have, in a collaborative manner, that would have a role in any type of enforcement type of policy, especially when we're talking about these type of products that we're talking about. You need to bring everybody to the table, and you need to respect everybody at the table. And you got to bring in the community, and you got to let them have a chair, a seat at the table, and it's a valid seat. It cannot be just make believe. So I would say we need the community. We need the community policing, but we need respect. We have to bring respect to the table, and that's what we can bring in a collaborative measure when we bring them all together, is we bring it with respect. And I want to thank everybody.
I think you'll get 100% agreement with us and probably the whole country with that. So that is great stuff. Commissioner Garcia, we probably have about 2 minutes. So can you kind of close us down with your final thoughts, and then we'll say our thank yous.
Good deal. Thank you, Johnny, and thank you for your work in moderating, and thank you to CHCI for the invitation to be here, and thank you to the other panelists, distinguished panelists, for their thoughts. It's been a very good conversation. I've enjoyed it immensely. I guess I would close with this point. Immigration is critical to the success of America, and so we have to find ways to facilitate it in a constructive and productive way. As I mentioned earlier, my father was a bracero, and if not for his experience there, my family would not have come to America. But it was because there was a effective process, an effective guest worker program that worked at the time that allowed the success of our family to come to this country. And so I would challenge the caucus to look. I'm a big fan of Biden-Harris. I voted for them. I'll vote for them again. But we do not need to allow them to not come to the table with recommendations to improve our immigration system. While there is a dysfunctional way to gain entry into the system, a 10-year waiting line, then the cartels will continue to be effective. So we need to continue to challenge the administration to come with recommendations on a comprehensive immigration law. But what we can do right now with a guest worker program. And then additionally, I'd like to also encourage the caucus to find ways to fund more initiatives like the human trafficking task force that the Harris County Sheriff's Office was the first to participate in back in the early 2000s, and fund other ways. I participated in the counterterrorism task force and was able to train several of my deputies to participate. These are the type of close relationships that we can build that will allow us to move further. I remember one of my first trips was to Mexico City to visit with the ambassador the U.S. ambassador in Mexico City, to create a more direct pipeline for critical intelligence that was specific to Harris County. Creating those pipelines will help us deal with those cartels and their underlings in our local communities. So again, I'm proud to have participated. Thank you for all, and looking forward to continuing this dialogue as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Commissioner Garcia. Thank you to all the panel here. I think it's been fantastic. We needed another hour because there was so much to talk about. I also want to give a special thanks to Representative Cuellar for his wise words at the beginning of this. And unfortunately, he couldn't be with us, but he's worked tirelessly at the border for many, many decades, and has been a fighter and a very rational person in this regard. So I really want to thank you for those of y'all that listen to it live. Thank you for being here. I'm going to say the hashtag one more time so you've got it. It's CHCI policy briefing. It's up on your screen so you can see it. Thank you for everyone who attended, and hopefully this was useful, and we'll see you next time.